There are moments in history when people watch the news unfold, scrolling headlines, sudden crises, unexpected shifts, and something deep inside whispers, "Haven T? We've seen this somewhere before." That eerie sense, the feeling that the present is echoing a forgotten script, is what surrounds the name Baba Vanga, the blind mystic from a small Balkan village whose visions have haunted generations. And if even a fragment of what people claim she foresaw is true, then we may already be standing inside the very storm she warned about. The year when the eagle trembles beneath its own shadow. Not everyone believes in prophecy. Many prefer numbers, data, logic, yet skepticism wavers when reality brushes too closely against predictions spoken decades earlier. Baba Vanga's legacy rests not on vague statements that can be twisted to fit any event, but on details, unsettlingly precise details. She spoke of iron birds striking the towers long before the world watched the Twin Towers fall. She described a wave that swallows coasts and takes hundreds of thousands before the 2004 tsunami reshaped entire nations. She spoke of a dark-skinned leader rising to unite America long before the world imagined a black US president. And somewhere in the quiet corners of her notes, she spoke of a fractured America, a man emerging from wealth rather than politics, and a year 2026 wrapped in both turmoil and revelation. These overlapping shadows, some clear, some symbolic, have turned her into a kind of mirror that people hold up to the world. Every crisis, every political shift, every unusual natural event becomes another piece of a puzzle that might have been laid out long ago. But among all her prophecies, none ignite as much debate, fascination, and fear as the ones connected to the United States and to a figure she allegedly described as the man who comes from gold and commerce. A man who would bend the trajectory of a nation without ever fitting into the mold of traditional politics. A man who would be celebrated, attacked, exiled, and then return. For many, that description aligns too easily with Donald Trump to ignore. His ascent in 2016 defied every established expectation, every poll, every prediction, every expert analysis. Then came the years of investigations, impeachments, accusations, indictments, a storm of legal and political warfare surrounding him. To those who believe in Baba Vanga's visions, this sequence doesn't look random, it looks scripted. Not by the world, but by a prophecy written decades before he ever appeared on the political stage. Yet the power of this story isn't just in a single man. It's in the nation. He stands inside of a nation. Baba Vanga described as splitting in its spirit before it splits on its map. She spoke of a fracture that begins quietly, like a hairline crack in ice, almost invisible until pressure makes it roar open. And when people look at the United States today, the polarization, the mistrust, the tension simmering beneath daily life, they begin to wonder if that crack has already begun to spread. The most unsettling element in Baba Vanga's narrative is not destruction, it's recognition. She didn't speak in the language of apocalypse, no sudden end, no cosmic explosion. She spoke of signs, of tremors before earthquakes, of storms before collapses. She warned that humanity would see these signs long before the breaking point, if they paid attention. As climate disasters grow more violent, as global alliances shift, as economies tremble and institutions lose the trust of their people, her words begin to feel less like myth and more like a map. And at the center of that map lies the year 2026, a year she described as the turning of the great wheel, the year of revelation, the year the eagle bows its head toward its own shadow. No one knows precisely what she meant, but ambiguity is its own kind of power. It pulls the present into its orbit, drawing parallels, raising questions, making every political tremor feel like a possible piece of something bigger. Those who met Baba Vanga claimed she spoke calmly, as though describing a book she had already read to its final page. And that is precisely what makes her prophecies so haunting. They give the sense that events are not chaotic, but sequential, that the world is not unraveling spontaneously, but following a curve that was set long before anyone noticed. But within these ominous visions, there is always a thread of hope. Baba Vanga did not speak only of collapse. She spoke of awakening, of people realizing how deceived they have been, how divided they have become, how deeply they have drifted from their essence. She said that crises shake nations, but awaken souls, and that a generation would emerge with eyes that see through smoke, choosing clarity over chaos, truth over noise. Maybe that is why, in this era of confusion, people return to her words more than ever. They want to know whether the chaos means something, whether the storms have a pattern, whether the fractures are signs of ending, or the birth pains of something new. And so a question forms, the very question many believe Baba wanted to leave behind. Will you recognize the signs while they are forming, or only after they have already passed? If you are still here, still listening, then perhaps you already feel the momentum of the narrative tightening. What comes next goes deeper into the heart of her warnings. The rise of the man from gold, the persecution, the foretold return, and the year she marked as the axis of America's fate. This was only the first step. The path ahead grows darker and clearer. There is a moment in Baba Vanga's recorded prophecies where the tone shifts, where she stops describing storms, collapse, or global turbulence and instead turns her focus onto a single figure. A man not from the world of politics, she reportedly said, but from gold and commerce. a man whose rise will defy the order of power, and whose fall will shake the eagle's throne. For many years, that description drifted like a vague silhouette, a symbol without a face. But as the 21st century unfolded, that silhouette began to sharpen, as though someone was stepping forward from behind a veil. Whether adored or despised, Donald Trump's ascent remains one of the most improbable political upsets in modern American history. A billionaire businessman, a television figure, a man who walked onto the political stage without the usual grooming, without the endorsements of long-standing institutions, and won. Analysts labeled his victory an anomaly. Commentators blamed broken polls or misread demographics. Yet for those who had spent years studying Vanga's words, there was a chilling familiarity in the story. It felt less like an accident and more like a page turned in an old prophecy. She spoke of a leader from wealth, not governance, rising in a period of deep cultural fatigue and distrust. A man who would not simply run for office, but disrupt the very foundation upon which political norms rested. She said he would divide not only parties but reality-splitting citizens into those who see the system's hidden fractures and those who refuse to look. And when you observe the aftermath of Trump's emergence, the impact he continues to exert long after leaving office, it becomes difficult to ignore the resonance between her words and the present narrative. But the prophecy did not end with his rise. Baba Vanga described a long corridor of trials, a barrage of accusations, investigations, and legal pursuits intended to break him, cleanse him, or reveal him. At the time these statements were written, they seemed poetic, dramatic, perhaps metaphorical. Today they sound nearly literal. Courts, indictments, hearings, headlines, commentators repeating his name day after day, as though the nation were caught in a gravitational loop around one man. Supporters see persecution, critics see justice. But Vanga's prophecy frames it differently, a refining fire meant to expose the true nature of power in America. She said the leader forged in gold would be dragged through fire, surrounded by those calling for his removal, forced to stand repeatedly before judges, not quietly pushed aside, not erased from public life, but placed at the center of a storm meant to reveal what lies beneath the surface of the eagle's wings. In her symbolic language, this trial by fire phase was necessary, not for him alone, but for the nation that watched. And then came the most controversial line in her prophecy, the one that continues to spark debate even now. She said that the man would return, not merely attempt to return, not hint at one, but return. His comeback would create a seismic shift, altering not only America's direction, but the balance of global power as well. And she marked a year beside that prediction, 2026. Why that year? What does it signify? No explanation was ever given, but the closer we move toward it, the more the weight of her words grows. The U.S. political landscape is once again reshaping itself around the figure she described. His presence dominates conversations, divides states, transforms alliances, and reveals with startling precision the cracks that were always there but never fully acknowledged. Yet her prophecy paints no triumphant parade. His return was not framed as victory but as a shield, a moment where the nation would be forced to confront the consequences of its divisions. His return will not bring unity, she said. It will bring revelation. That single phrase opens a door to endless interpretations. Revelation of institutional decay. Revelation of corruption. Revelation of public disillusionment, or perhaps revelation of how deeply a society can fracture before healing begins. Betrayal, too, sat within her warnings. Those who once stood beside him will turn their faces away, she said. And today, echoes of that warning ripple through politics. Former advisors testifying, former allies distancing themselves, former supporters redirecting their loyalty elsewhere. Whether one sees this as strategy or survival, the parallels to her imagery are impossible to ignore. But perhaps the most striking piece of this prophecy is her symbolic description of his role. He is not the storm, he is the mirror. She portrayed him as the figure standing in the heart of chaos. One hand raised against the wind, not to command it, but to reflect it. His presence exposes the fracture lines, the storm fronts, the suppressed tensions that were already building beneath the surface of American life long before he appeared. According to Vanga's words, he is not the source of the turmoil, he is the spotlight that forces a nation to see it. And as 2026 approaches, her warnings begin to feel less like distant mythology and more like a slow acceleration toward a known point on the horizon. The question now is not whether the man from gold will return, he already has. In influence, in relevance, in the collective conversation, the deeper question, the one hovering like a shadow over the coming years, is whether that return marks the beginning of the transformation she spoke of, or the unraveling she feared. For Baba Vanga never focused solely on the man, he was merely the catalyst. What concerned her most was the world that would rise around him, the fracture. The economic tremors, the political unrest, she said, would erupt when the man of gold steps once more toward the throne. And to understand that storm, and the year she singled out as its peak, the path now must turn toward the prophecy she called the Great Fracturing. The year Baba Vanga marked as a turning point was not chosen at random. She spoke of it as a threshold, a hinge upon which the fate of a nation would swing, a year when the eagle would feel its wings strain under the weight of its own divisions. She called it the Great Fracturing, a phrase that once sounded symbolic, almost poetic. but today it feels disturbingly literal, as though the country has been walking toward this destination for decades without realizing it. She described America entering a period when its greatest threat would not come from foreign enemies, but from itself, from the tearing of its own internal fabric, from citizens no longer recognizing the nation reflected in their neighbors' eyes. And if one looks closely at the currents beneath the surface of American life, it becomes difficult to dismiss the idea that these cracks have already begun to widen. A country divided not just by ideology, but by reality. Not simply by opinion, but by truth itself. Baba Vanga's portrayal of this time was vivid, though cloaked in metaphor. She spoke of states raising their banners against the center, of local leaders rebuking federal authority, of regions drifting toward their own separate identities. Not an official secession, not a civil war in the conventional sense, but a quiet unraveling, a splitting of allegiance and belief. In her words, the eagle's feathers will pull away from the spine long before the wings attempt to fly apart. A picture not of sudden collapse, but of slow, painful disconnection. The economic realm, she warned, would not remain untouched. She spoke of a weakening currency, a faltering world order, a shift in global alliances. When she described a moment when the eagle's coin loses its shine, few could have imagined a future where nations openly challenged the dominance of the US dollar. Yet today, the rise of BRICS, the strengthening of alternative currencies, and the mounting American debt paint a picture eerily similar to what she hinted at. She said that America would feel the trembling beneath its feet before anyone else recognized the shift of power taking shape. She also warned that economic instability would amplify the internal fractures, that protests would swell. Not from ideology alone, but from fear. She described crowds gathering outside government buildings, a sea of voices demanding clarity, demanding answers, while those inside struggled to maintain control. And once again, reality seems to drift toward the image she cast. The past decade has seen protests of historic scale, distrust of institutions at unprecedented levels, and a population increasingly convinced that something fundamental is slipping away. But Baba Vanga's warnings grew even more specific. She spoke of a crisis of authority, a moment when the nation's foundational system, the Constitution, itself, would be questioned, strained, stretched to its limits. Not abolished, but tested in ways it had never been tested before. According to her, this crisis would not erupt suddenly. It would begin with a single, unexpected event, something small enough to be dismissed at first, yet powerful enough to trigger a chain reaction across the country. She did not specify what it would be, only that it would arrive early in the year she marked 2026. Speculation about this trigger event varies wildly. Some interpret it as a cyber attack, others as a financial collapse, others as a political confrontation that spirals out of control. But the essence of her warning was not about the event itself. It was about the nation's response. She said that this moment would reveal the depth of America's internal division, exposing how fragile unity had become beneath the polished surface of everyday life. And, as if anticipating the complexities of the modern world, she described a federal government struggling to find footing amid competing pressures, states resisting directives, citizens rejecting federal authority, institutions caught in political crossfire. The eagle, she said, will look inward and see two shadows, one shadow defined by control, order, and central authority, the other defined by defiance, decentralization, and rebellion. In her visions, these two shadows did not immediately break apart. Instead, they coexisted uneasily within the same body, pulling in opposite directions, weakening the spine that held them together. People often imagine collapse as a sudden, theatrical moment, but Vanga saw it differently. She saw a slow bending tension building quietly, silently, until the structure creaks under the weight of unresolved conflict. She also warned that spiritual disorientation would accompany the political fracture, not a loss of religion, but a loss of meaning, citizens no longer trusting the narratives offered to them, questioning every official statement, every media report, every institution they once held sacred. She described a nation in which the voice of authority will split into 1,000 echoes, and no one will know which one speaks truth. It is a haunting image, and one that feels painfully familiar in the age of misinformation, distrust, and algorithm-driven realities. But the most unsettling part of her prophecy is the suggestion that this fracturing is not simply a political or economic shift. To her, it was the spiritual test of the nation, the moment when America confronts the truth of what it has become. She said the fracture would reveal what had always been hidden, corruption long ignored, divisions long denied, wounds long covered by the veneer of unity. And yet, even in the bleakest lines of her prophecy, she offered a subtle glimmer of something else, an implication that the fracturing was not merely destructive. She said that the breaking open of what is old makes space for what is new, that a nation cannot be reborn until it faces the truth of its reflection, that the eagle cannot rise again until it sees its own wings clearly. Her words leave a lingering question. Is the great fracturing the end of the American story, or simply the end of a chapter, a transition, not a collapse? As the prophecy moves forward, her focus shifts from the political and economic cracks to forces even larger, the earth itself, and the machines humanity has built. For in her visions, The turmoil inside the nation coincides with turmoil beneath the ground and within the circuitry of the modern world. And to understand the deeper storm forming around 2026, we must follow her next thread. The warning of a world where nature and technology both begin to rebel. Baba Vanga rarely spoke in linear times. Her visions moved like tides, the political weaving into the natural folding into the technological, each layer amplifying the others until the world she described resembled a vast storm with multiple centers. As her prophecy for 2026 deepens, the narrative shifts from fractures within society to disturbances and forces far larger than any government. The trembling of the earth itself, and the awakening of machines humanity believed it commanded. She described a period when the ground beneath human civilization would no longer feel stable, when the rhythms of nature would break from their familiar patterns. Storms would come earlier, harsher, stranger. Winds that once followed seasonal paths would twist unpredictably. She spoke of the sky opening its furnace, a phrase many later connected to intensifying heat waves, solar storms, and fire raining from above. At the time, no one understood the imagery. Today, when cities choke under wildfire smoke and satellites tremble under solar flares, the metaphor feels far less cryptic. She also warned of earthquakes appearing in regions where tremors were unheard of. The earth will move where it once slept, she said. And in the last 2 decades, previously quiet fault lines have awakened, Europe shaking. The American Midwest rumbling, volcanic systems stirring beneath oceans and ice sheets. These events alone would not define a prophecy, but occurring in parallel with social unrest and political division, they begin to carry the weight of a pattern, the very pattern she hinted at when she said nature would mirror the disorder of humanity. Among her most chilling phrases was fire from the sky. Many dismiss it as symbolic, but interpretations today stretch in several directions. Some believe she was describing meteors or cosmic debris, now monitored closely by space agencies. Others think she foresaw solar storms, which modern scientists warn could cripple electrical grids, and many connect it to the unprecedented wildfires that have devoured entire landscapes, turning daylight into a smoky twilight. In her language, these phenomena were not punishments, but warnings. The earth signaling that humanity had drifted too far from balance. Yet the natural world was only part of what she saw unraveling in this era. Baba Vanga also spoke of the mind of metal, machines that think, systems that decide, devices that no longer wait for human permission. Her words surfaced long before artificial intelligence existed, long before algorithms wrote songs, piloted weapons, predicted elections, or influenced economies. She said humanity would reach a moment where it realizes it has handed too much power to its creations, trusting tools that cannot feel, bowing before silent judges made of circuits. At first, the warnings seemed outlandish, but as AI systems today draft legislation, filter information, control infrastructure, and shape public perception through invisible digital pathways, her words gain a new kind of clarity. She described a crisis not of rebellion, but of realization, a moment when people understand they can no longer trace the logic behind decisions that affect their lives. And around the mid-2020s, she said, this realization would strike with full force. To her, the convergence of political instability, natural disruption, and technological acceleration was not coincidence but alignment. She called it the trifold storm, a point where humanity would struggle to understand which threat mattered most, because all three fed into each other. Natural disasters would stress economies. Economic fear would fuel social division. Social division would drive people toward machines for answers, and the machines, in turn, would amplify the confusion with their cold, precise, emotionless certainty. But in her visions, there was yet another center of tension, one not created by nature or algorithms, but by nations themselves. Baba Vanga foresaw a surge in global confrontation, a tightening of alliances that once drifted loosely, and a sharpening of boundaries between East and West. She said the world would approach a trembling line where proxy conflicts escalate, where powerful nations send warnings across oceans, where the slightest miscalculation could ignite something irreversible. Her words described a moment when multiple flashpoints would glow at once. A European conflict refusing to settle, tension across the Pacific sharpening like a drawn blade, a peninsula bristling with missiles, a desert nation inching toward nuclear capability. She never said these places by name, only that the map will burn in several corners before the fire moves inward. Observers today cannot help but connect her imagery to Ukraine, Taiwan, North Korea, and Iran, regions where geopolitical friction grows hotter each year. And as if the world itself were aligning with her warnings, she suggested that nature, technology, and geopolitics would collide in a single era. Economic systems strained by disasters, governments challenged by internal division, military strategies rewritten by AI, nations standing at the brink of conflict. The eagle, her symbol for America, caught in a vortex of external pressure and internal unraveling, unsure whether to rise, retreat, or transform. Then came her most haunting description, the Great Silence, a moment when the noise of the world would suddenly collapse. Not peace, but paralysis. She spoke of networks failing, broadcasts stopping, governments going dark. Some interpret this as a massive cyber attic, others as a breakdown of infrastructure caused by solar storms or conflict. Some hear a spiritual metaphor, humanity forced to face itself without distraction. But whatever the cause, he said, the silence would divide people into two kinds, those who panic in the absence of noise, and those who listen to what the silence reveals. Her prophecy suggests that the great silence is not destruction, but interruption, a forced pause in a civilization that forgot how to stop. And in that pause, she said, eyes unopened for decades will finally see. Whether these warnings are literal, symbolic, or a blend of both, the convergence she described is impossible to ignore. A nation divided, a world trembling, the earth shifting, technology accelerating beyond comprehension, power blocks forming, and above it all, a sense that something long hidden is rising toward the surface. Her prophecy ends with a transition, not a conclusion. For after the storms of nature, the rebellion of machines, and the silence of systems, she said humanity would enter an age of revelation, not because truth suddenly appears, but because the illusions finally fall away. And that path leads directly into her final, most enigmatic visions, the rise of the red light, the great revelation, and the rebirth she believed would follow the chaos. Baba Vanga's final visions did not dwell solely on catastrophe. In fact, the deeper her prophecies ventured into darkness, the more they hinted at an unexpected brightness waiting beyond it, a kind of dawn that could only emerge after the world had been shaken awake. She spoke of an era she called the Great Revelation, a time when truths long buried beneath politics, power, and illusion would rise to the surface with the same inevitability as tectonic plates forcing mountains upward. And she tied this revelation not to governments or institutions, but to the people themselves, to the ordinary, the overlooked, the ones who had been silently questioning the world around them for years. She said the revelation would begin quietly, a leak here, a whistleblower there, a document resurfacing, a hidden network exposed, a voice emerging from a place no one expected. These fragments of truth would not come from the traditional pillars of society. They would come from decentralized platforms, from independent journalists, from digital outposts that governments and corporations could not fully control. The more systems attempted to suppress them, she said, the more fiercely they would spread. Truth, in her words, will not return as a river, but as a flood. But Baba Vanga also warned that this flood would not distinguish between truth and deception. In the chaos of revelation, lies would travel beside facts, distortions beside clarity. She spoke of a world where the eyes of the people will open, but some will be blinded by what they see. It was not enough for secrets to surface. Humanity would have to discern what was real within the noise. And that, she believed, was the true spiritual test of the era. In her prophecies, the great revelation was inseparably connected to the return of the man from gold, not because he brought truth, but because his presence exposed it. She described him as a catalyst whose actions and conflicts would force long-hidden shadows into the light. Corruption within institutions, divisions buried under patriotic slogans, systems that had operated unquestioned for decades. Under the pressure surrounding him, she said, the eagle will see its reflection for the first time in generations, a reflection that would either horrify or awaken it, depending on the eyes that beheld it. And as though anticipating the modern information war, she warned that during this time, propaganda and authenticity would intertwine like smoke around a flame. Those who looked outward for answers would drown in confusion. But those who turned inward, she said, will hear a voice they had forgotten, a voice of discernment, intuition, conscience, instinct. Baba Vanga believed that spiritual clarity, not intellectual knowledge, would be the key to navigating the storm of information. Her most mysterious symbol emerged in this period, the man of the red light. She never clarified whether he was a person, a sign, or an event. He will appear in the moment of silence, she said, referring to the great silence that precedes the revelation. And when the red light falls upon the tower, the path will divide in two. Some interpret this as a political figure exposed under intense public scrutiny. Others as a technological warning, perhaps involving surveillance, cyber systems, or digital platforms that control the modern world. Many believe the tower symbolizes seats of power: Washington, London, corporate headquarters, or even digital towers of information. The red light, they argue, could represent danger, exposure, judgment. Regardless of the interpretation, Baba Vanga's message was clear. A singular moment would force humanity to choose between fear and awareness, illusion and truth. The man of the red light was less important than what he represented. The moment the veil would be torn, and the world would see not only what had been hidden, but what it had allowed to grow in darkness. And then, curiously, her tone softened. After speaking of division, collapse, deception, and trial, she described something unexpected: a rebirth. Not the triumph of a political movement or a dramatic overthrow of governments, but a quiet, subtle transformation arising from the people themselves. She said America, the eagle she so often referenced, would not be rebuilt by institutions, but by consciousness. The house will burn, she whispered, but the warmth that remains will build the new one. In her vision, communities would form small circles of truth and cooperation outside of traditional systems. Independent economies, parallel education networks, spiritual collectives, not led by leaders hungry for power, but by ordinary individuals rediscovering the value of integrity. A rebirth not through conquest, but through healing. Not through victory, but through clarity. She said that from the chaos of 2026 would emerge a generation that no longer accepted illusions. A generation willing to question everything, to rebuild slowly, to choose unity not because they were told to, but because they understood the cost of division. This was the America she foresaw beyond the fracture, not a political revolution, but a spiritual one. And lingering at the very end of her prophecy was a final warning, quiet but piercing. The light will not save all, only those who see it. The age of confusion, she said, would be filled with false prophets, false saviors, and false promises. Many would run toward the brightest light, only to find it artificial. Only those willing to look inward, to recognize the truth without embellishment, would navigate the new era with clarity. Her closing message was simple, almost tender. Prepare not with fear, but with awareness. Build not fortresses, but connections. Guard not wealth, but integrity. And remember that the greatest battles of the future would not be fought with weapons, but with perception, truth against deception, clarity against confusion, consciousness against manipulation. And so the circle of her prophecy closes where it began. Not with the world ending, but with a choice. A choice that each individual, each household, each nation must make as the storm approaches, the choice to see or to remain blind. For in Baba Vanga's final words, the blind will lead the blind, until one dares to see,